This is Eitan Weinstein.
And I'm Naor Menninger, and you're listening to Two Nice Jewish Boys.
In the quiet streets of the Emanuel settlement, Malka Leifer appeared to be just another face in the crowd, blending seamlessly into the fabric of daily life. Yet beneath this ordinary facade lay a story that would captivate and horrify a nation. Leifer, a former headmistress at the Adat Israel school in Melbourne, was under suspicion for heinous acts of sexual abuse against her students, minors. Her saga, marked by a cunning flight from Australia and a controversial claim of mental unfitness for trial, unfolds against the backdrop of international legal drama, challenging the very principles of justice and accountability. The case of Malka Leifer is not an isolated incident, but a symptom of a deeper, more pervasive issue within the Haredi community. Sexual assault, often shrouded in silence and taboo, leaves its victims isolated and desperate for support. This societal challenge poses profound questions about power, protection, and the willingness of a community to confront uncomfortable truths. As the struggle for justice for Leifer's victims continues, it reveals the complexities of balancing religious loyalty with the imperative to safeguard the innocent. Enter Shana Aaronson, the CEO of an organization dedicated to protecting victims of sexual assault within the ultra-Orthodox community. With a mission fueled by personal conviction and a deep understanding of the nuanced dynamics of Haredi society, Aaronson and her team stand at the forefront of a tireless fight for justice. Their work, emblematic of a broader struggle for change, brings hope to those who have suffered in silence, offering a beacon of support in a landscape often dominated by power and patriarchy. As we delve into this episode, we explore the courage, challenges, and unwavering commitment of those who dare to stand up against sexual assault in the Haredi community. We are thrilled to be joined today by Shana Aaronson. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So maybe we start with what got you into this mess? I mean, this is like, I feel like most kids probably don't, dream of growing up and doing this.
No, I hope not, actually.
Yeah.
So it started, I think probably when I first started thinking about this, I pretty much was a kid. I was probably about 14. I grew up obviously in a very Haredi community and
Which
family.
sect?
Litvish. My parents were more from the Bali Tshuva community, but I was before my family made Aliyah, I was in a very Haredi school in America, but in the Midwest, and then we moved here, and so my parents put me into the most Haredi school here in where we lived, which we soon learned was not the same thing as what Haredi in America meant. That was a learning experience over a couple of years. I ended up going back to America for school myself, but there were a couple of years there where things got a little dicey for me in terms of the crowd that I got in with. One of the things that I remember noticing when I was about 14 was just how many of my friends had been sexually abused and how this kept coming up, and very casually. I mean, we were 14, we didn't know what the heck we were doing or talking about, but there was like this, just sort of this running theme. It kept like, I don't know, it would just come up, one friend, another friend, and I remember at one point saying to someone, like, it's so weird, I feel like this is maybe this is happening in other places, because what are the odds that it's just like everyone that I know? Like, that doesn't make any sense.
How would it come up casually, if I can ask? Like, what kind of things would be mentioned?
So in retrospect, the truth is I only remember it starting to come up when I was like 14, 15, and when my friends were a little bit more at risk, where some were somewhat leaving the Haredi community or sort of flirting on the edge. But in retrospect, there were friends that I had from even when I was younger, like really a child, who I'm sure were being sexually abused at home based on things that they described, games that they would play. it's, again, now in my adult mind, just looking back, I can see some very, very clear red flags of what was going on there and some things that they were clearly experiencing. But obviously at the time I had no idea. This was just weird. Yeah, it was a strange pattern. And I remember at one point, I think when I was 14, saying to someone, like, maybe one day I'll do like a doctorate on this, like I'll do like research. And thankfully the world did not wait around for me to get my doctorate to start actually talking about this, because I really at the time thought, like, oh, it's so strange that this isn't being talked about. Like, I wonder if, like, maybe no one's noticed that so many kids from the Haredi community, like, maybe no one's realized that so many people are being sexually abused. I now realize that no, people realized it was the fact that it wasn't being talked about was quite intentional.
Why?
And I mean, there's all the reasons that I think in general in the world people don't talk about having been sexually abused. There's an incredible amount of shame and stigma associated with it. Thankfully, that's something that has started to change in the world in general, but we still have a long way to go there. It's something that, I mean, sexual abuse specifically, unlike most other kinds of abuse, although that's not true because it really can, this can come up in other forms of abuse as well, but there is something unique in that if I'm walking down the street and someone punches me in the face, I'm most likely not going to think that I did something that made them punch me in the face. Like, there's going to be a clear, but sexual abuse and the nature of just how it often comes about is there's a lot of manipulation and a grooming process, and victims feel incredibly guilty and like there's something that they did wrong or that they should have stopped or they should have understood or should have realized. Yeah, so I think that's something that exists everywhere. That's not unique to the Haredi community. But then if you throw in all of the added layers of complexity and shame that go along with the Haredi community, just the general discomfort of discussing or relating or even approaching anything related to sex in general, even in the best of circumstances, and then everything related to shidduchim, the matchmaking system of, there's levels. There's level like sug aleph, sug bet, and the fear of being put into a lower category and how that's going to affect not only the victim themselves but their whole family. This might affect all the siblings, as well as but that goes back, I think, even further to the schools, getting into the right schools, getting accepted into the right schools, which it all sort of feeds into the schools, affects the shidduchim. It all sort of goes together. There definitely is somewhat of a system of class or caste in the sense of, that, like I said, there's levels. So, and being sexually abused has been seen as something that's going to put you into a lower level. And how will that affect the family?
So as a teenager, or before or a bit after, was there like a specific story of someone you knew that triggered something? Like, what's the first hand you heard about?
I remember I had a friend who was raped, and she told us about it, and she was afraid that she might be pregnant. Also, in retrospect, there was no way she was pregnant, but we didn't know a whole lot about how someone got pregnant, and so we were really scared. And I remember going to the pharmacy. I said, you need to take a pregnancy test. And she was like, I'm not buying a pregnancy test. So I was like, well, then I'm going to buy the pregnancy test, because what are we going to do? You got to take this test. And I remember going into the pharmacy in the Tachana Merkazit in Jerusalem, downstairs, and getting this pregnancy test. And I was wearing my Beis Yaakov uniform. And I was sure that, like, the police were going to show up and arrest me. Like, all the alarms were going to start going. I was, like, waiting for, like, a security guard to, like, stop me. Because, like, who would let this, like, 14-year-old girl in a Beis Yaakov, buy a pregnancy? Like, how? No one's going to let this happen. And then I was shocked to find that, like, the woman at the counter didn't really seem to care. Yeah. I'm not sure she noticed or was paying attention. Like, and I just somehow walked out of there with this pregnancy test. Like, I felt like I'd robbed a bank.
2 for half a price.
Yes, exactly. Like, what does she care? And
she's like, do you want some batteries with that?
Right. Anything else? We went into the bathrooms, and I remember it was a ridiculous scenario. Like, my friend was taking this pregnancy test. We're trying to figure out, like, how this thing works. And then another one of my friends was sitting on the floor of the bathroom saying to him, literally praying that this, like, this was all of us in the uniforms or whatever. And I just remember thinking, like, where are the adults? It, like, even then, I just remember thinking, like, there's something wrong with this picture. And I mean, I was 14. I believed I knew everything there was to know in the world. But I knew there was something very off about this just situation. Like, this wasn't really the way it should be. Why are we a bunch of teenagers sitting on the floor of a bathroom?
Do you know who was the perpetrator?
Yeah.
Can you share?
So this was a situation where the perpetrator was another teenager.
Okay.
He was also somebody who grew up in the ultra-Orthodox community. He had very much left. And in this case, I really do think, and I struggle with this because sometimes there are, I think, among teenagers that leave the ultra-Orthodox community, the truth is there's this issue among a lot of teenagers, but a lack of understanding of what constitutes consent. And I think just looking back and the way she described what happened, I don't think, and I don't want to excuse it because what he did was really unacceptable. And he later actually apologized to her and I think grew up a little bit and understood that what he had done was really not okay. But he had kept pushing. She didn't resist in the way that was so obvious that she was resisting. And I think that there is a real problem with among young teenagers, I'm talking about specifically, like really young, of not understanding what consent means and what enthusiastic consent means. And I think that's, I mean, I don't think I need to think it. I think it's something that clearly is the case. We've got this problem, I think, with teens across the board, young people who, but I think especially for teenagers who are coming out of the Haredi community where the extent of sex education that they've had is don't talk to girls. That's about it. And I think he really, again, I don't want this to sound like I'm excusing him, but he genuinely afterwards seemed to really not have understood why what he had done was wrong. And again, he did later apologize, and it was complicated, but there was some attempt at making amends there.
So you mentioned that, you know, it was only after you moved to Israel that you had realized how prevalent this problem was within the Haredi community, or at least, I mean, you know, the Haredi community is pretty much what you knew, so how prevalent it was. Is it now, looking back, is it something that is more prevalent in the Haredi community, and is it something that's more prevalent in the Haredi community in Israel than it is in the United States, or are these things that you don't think are necessarily so, like...
It's really hard for me to answer that. I always want to answer that, and unfortunately I can't because there's not yet been enough research, or pretty much almost any research, on this topic. I can tell you what I believe just anecdotally, which is always dangerous and might get me in trouble with a lot of people. I don't think that there are more sexual abusers in the Haredi community than in other places. I think that where we have an issue that becomes more difficult or more complicated than in other places is stopping those abusers after they've hurt 4 people instead of 80 people. Because there has been historically this resistance to reporting or resistance to dealing with abuse by any means outside of internally. People, I mean, this would be logical to say that people will get away with abusing more victims before they're stopped, or if they're ever stopped. So I think that, you know, anecdotally it would, put it this way, I just recently heard a professional, a criminologist who works in the Haredi community with sexual perpetrators, sexual abuse perpetrators say that, you know, he said, put it this way, I have never met a professional that works in this field in the Haredi community who believes there's less sexual abuse than anywhere else, meaning less abuse being perpetrated. And again, I don't think it's a matter, like I really do believe just from the limited research that there's been and just the research that we have about the general population, my instinct, based on what I've seen, is that there are not more sexual abusers, but until we start stepping up how quickly we deal with them, they're going to get access to more victims before they get stopped.
I see.
So that's, yeah.
So,
yeah, how did you... Okay, grew up?
Yes.
And how did you
I
come to this
started
organization of
working
yours?
with at-risk teens. That was after my own personal experiences. I thought I want to really support teenagers who are leaving the community, but leaving the community in a really kind of toxic, unhealthy way. I'm not talking about people who leave the community because they have, decided this is not for them. I'm talking about people who have turned to drugs or alcoholism or unsafe sexual practices, or have just gotten into a really kind of delinquent life as they've left. And in that's where I started working in that field, and very quickly just continued to see that it seemed like every other person that I was talking to had been sexually abused. I worked as the assistant director in a residential therapeutic program for a few years, and about 85% of the students there were all victims of, I'd say, severe sexual abuse. And I was like, well, this seems to indicate maybe there's some sort of, like, maybe this is related somehow. And it just kept, I felt like it was following me. I now know that it wasn't really following me. It's just everywhere. And after I finished working in that position, I started volunteering at Magen. At the time, Magen was a very different organization. It was a small local organization based in Beit Shemesh that dealt with child abuse in a much broader way, not just sexual abuse. Actually, primarily at that point, I think we were dealing with physical violence, like in schools. And things evolved. I ended up collaborating with other organizations and getting involved in a number of different projects. And then at some point, started working as a case manager in Magen, and then shifted over to a different organization in working with a different organization in America. And then I think about 6 years ago was when I took over Magen, and we started making the Magen of today is sort of an evolution of the Magen then, and sort of a combination of a number of different projects and initiatives and organizations and activists that we sort of all pulled together to create the Magen of now, which includes basically at this point we have like 3 different departments. The first is to the goal of raising awareness and education. So we've created a lot of different educational resources for parents and for children that are specific to the religious community. We do educational events for parents, like workshops, as well as trainings for professionals. And
You have a hotline?
Yes. So the hotline relates more to the other 2 departments, which is although not only, because we do a lot of like etiatzut, where people will reach out for advice of, I suspect something's going on with a neighbor. What do I do? I suspect my child maybe saw something in school, something happened to them in school. How do I open up the subject with them without scaring them? So we do get a lot of that. And then we have the mental health services department. So we have social workers who we refer to therapy. We work with clinics all over the country. We don't do therapy in-house, but we work with a lot of different programs that will sort of help people find the therapy that's right for them. Sometimes that's very simple. It's just a matter of directing them to the clinic that's nearby. Sometimes it's finding them, therapy that's funded, that, for a 5-year-old kid who speaks Yiddish. There's not a very long list of therapists that meet their criteria. So yeah, that can be sometimes easier, sometimes more difficult. And we also have a number of different support groups for victims and for parents. We actually have one for ex-wives of abusers, which is a population that really needs a lot of support. And we have our advocacy and investigation department, which basically deals with supporting victims through all of kind of law enforcement and criminal, civil, legal proceedings. Mm-hmm. That might mean helping somebody make a report to social services, to the Revachah if they need to, and helping them navigate that process. That might mean physically going with victims to the police. Sometimes it means helping them find a Beit Din that will work for them if they are determined to go through a rabbinic process. Now, obviously, in situations where there's a mandated reporting situation, so we will report it, or we will help them report it. And then we also do some private investigation work as well, which is, I think, for a number of years, what most people knew us for, because of cases like the Malka Leifer case. It tends to be the most public pieces of the work that we do are from that department, just because the media
It's
takes the
sexy.
most interest. Yeah, it's the media takes the most interest
I
in
don't
it.
know if
Nobody
I'd use
really.
that word.
No, we
Yeah.
use that word sometimes. It's true. Everybody wants to feel like James Bond. Everybody
Yeah.
wants
Yeah.
to get in on that side of that side of things.
So there's a department for awareness. There's a department for sort of emotional and psychological support, and then there's a department that's more legal. I want to get into some of the bigger cases that you've dealt with, and maybe also talk about some of the support, the psychological and emotional support groups that you guys provide. But before that, I wanted to ask you maybe a personal question that just kind of popped into mind, which is, do you have a family? Like, are you a mother?
Yeah.
You're a mother.
Yeah, I am married with 3 kids.
With 3 kids. Are you not terrified? I mean, living within the Haredi community, like knowing what you just told us, that, you know, okay, perhaps there's the same amount of abusers, but they get more victims. So ultimately, you know, I don't care how many abusers there are. I care how many victims
Right.
there are. Are you not worried that, like, you're raising your children in a community that there is a higher risk for this? Because I was just thinking about, you know, you said parents call and they're like, I have a fear that my child might have, you know, something might have happened. And I'm thinking, like, just to think that is terrifying.
Statistics don't really work the way that it, like, I know that statistically my children have first of all, the statistics that are known today in Israel are that basically all children in Israel, meaning minors until the age of 18, there's a 1 in 5% chance of being abused, meaning 1 in 5 children will be sexually abused before their 18th birthday, and that's for both boys and girls. Because the statistics vary. After age 16, it's higher for girls than boys, but up until that age, it's the same for both. And that, so far, and again, the research is limited in terms of how much it's broken down by communities, but this is overall. This does include both the Haredi populations, the Jewish, Muslim, Christian. This is across the board, and that's pretty terrifying. 1 in 5 is pretty darn high. But what I always tell parents, because they, you know, I work a lot with families where they tend to have more than 5 children in any given family. So you say that in a room of people where they've all got 7 kids and everyone's like having a heart attack, because that means statistically they're all going to have at least one child that was sexually abused. But statistics don't work like that. There's risk factors and there's red flags. You know, we know that children of parents, of single parents, have higher rates of being abused. That doesn't mean that if you're a single parent, your child's going to be abused. There's other things that you can do to mitigate that risk. You know, children that spend, I don't remember what the exact, there was research that was done, the parents that spend something like a minimum of 10 minutes with each child a day, the rates of sexual abuse lower. There's all different things that can be done. It's just not the way, like I said, statistics don't work that way. So there's, as much as it's something that's very concerning to me, I also know that I've done a lot of things to mitigate risk, as much as I can in my end. And there's absolutely nothing, I know there's absolutely nothing that I do, and I tell this to parents all the time, there's nothing that you can do to be, in any community, to be 100% sure that your child will not be sexually abused, except perhaps locking them in a room alone for their entire lives, in which case they're going to have a whole host of other major issues that I do not recommend.
Can raise his awareness, her
right.
awareness.
Well, it's not just about raising his or her awareness, meaning for the child, because children can't, and that's actually, it's a risky thing, because sometimes when we talk about educating our children or making them aware about abuse, it can be understood as putting a onus of responsibility onto the child to protect themselves. Children can't protect themselves. No child, no matter how educated or aware, will have the mental, emotional, psychological, practical ability, strength to stand up to a perpetrator in certain situations. Like, we're all, even as adults, I mean, most people, certainly most women, have probably had the situation or had been in the scenario of being on a bus or being in a public place, and all of a sudden they realize someone's touching them and they freeze, because you're not prepared for that in that situation. Maybe as you're talking about it and you're like, if this were to happen to me, I would do X. But in that moment, you're not expecting it. You're not in that mindset. That's exactly the point. That's what predators, they rely on the fact that you're not expecting. You're not standing there on a bus expecting to have to fight off some guy grabbing you from behind. It's just, you're not in that mindset. So children are never in that mindset. It's just not, doesn't matter how many times you talk to them. If they're in that scenario and it's their teacher or it's their counselor, they're not, they can't, it's not something that the vast majority of children can even process in that moment.
But they shouldn't hide it.
Exactly. The success rates of therapy with children who have been abused are obviously much, much, much higher the sooner the abuse is disclosed and the sooner that the treatment can be given, and obviously the sooner the abuse is stopped. You can't compare abuse that happened one time as opposed to happen, if it went on for months. So that really is the goal. The goal is to raise children that can pick up on things. I have a child who had a situation on a train. A man sat down next to him. He was there. He was on the train with his camp, and he ended up sitting a little bit separate from the other kids because the counselors apologized profusely. They hadn't noticed that there wasn't like enough room right there, so he was like 2 seats back. It wasn't really the end of the world, but he wasn't immediately visible to the counselors. And a man sat down next to him, and when he came to me afterwards, he was so shocked. It was almost like it was so crazy because it was almost like all of a sudden he understood everything that I do in this different light. And he was like, Mommy, he looked like a rabbi. Like, he really looked like, you're right. They don't look like bad people. I said, I know. He was like, it's crazy. It was like all of a sudden, just, whoa. The guy sat down next to him and he started talking. First he was like allegedly learning with him. And then he started talking about some really inappropriate topics. Asking him how much he knows about women, and it was veering into like clear sexual connotations. And my son got up. He told him he had to go to the bathroom. He went to the bathroom past where his friends were, and he told his friends, come and get me and pretend you need me. Like, I need to get away from this guy. Went back, sat down, and the friends a minute later came and said, we need you to come sit next to us. And then at that point, right away, the counselors realized what was going on. And he said to me, I should have tried to take a picture so that and I was just like, he's been living with me long enough to know. And I just said to him, no, like your only job when you are a kid in that situation, your only job is to get yourself out of that situation. There's nothing else. So you did everything that you were supposed to do. So now I feel like when I share that story, there's almost like you could flip that story and say, okay, and then for every child who didn't do that, for every child who doesn't pick up on that, it's somehow the parents' fault. They didn't prepare them enough. It just doesn't work like that, because my son could have also in that moment frozen, been so completely shocked by the fact that this guy looked like a rabbi and that he just sat there. Or he actually said before he got up and went to the bathroom, he pretended to be asleep. He thought if he pretends to fall asleep, and I just immediately was like, oh God, because that could really backfire. And thankfully it didn't. The guy did not start touching him while he was pretend sleeping, but he kept trying to talk to him. So that was when my son got up and walked away. So like it could have ended a whole host of different ways, and thank God it ended fairly quickly. And
How old is your son?
He was 12.
He was 12. Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Which is also like, I guess, funny to say, but a privilege to be that age in those situations. Meaning, many kids are 6, 7.
Oh, sure,
even younger,
absolutely,
and
of course.
And then they don't
older,
have the wherewithal to have those kind of mature.
And the fact is that I remember when my son was in different son was in first grade, and he had his first school trip. It was the beginning of the year. They went to the Kotel. I was a wreck. Beforehand, I was so nervous, and we get the speeches over and over again. What do you do if you're separated from your class? What do you do? You find a mom, and then finally he said to me, Mommy, you don't have to worry. I'm going to the Kotel. Everybody there is wearing a talis, so they're all tzaddikim. And I was like, no. You've listened to nothing. He was 6, and that's how much he had absorbed what the over and over. Clearly he was not prepared for much of anything at that point. Thankfully, he didn't get separated from the class. But that's why, you can give kids information, and the problem is that we actually see sometimes the opposite. There are a lot of therapists that point to children that are given the say no, run away speech over and over again, often actually feel like a compounded level of guilt if they're abused, when they're abused, because they knew what they were supposed to do and they didn't manage. So they knew, so now they broke the rules. The rule was you say no and you run away, and they didn't say no and run away, so now they did something wrong. So there's this added level of shame.
Yeah.
I was supposed to stop this. I was taught how to stop this, and I didn't. When the fact is, no, children can't stop abuse. They have, like, if all the stars align, like in a situation with my son, they can manage to extricate themselves from the situation, which call kavod to him. But like I said, that
Otherwise,
could have ended
it's
8
not-
different ways
yeah.
that would not have been as good.
So tell us a little bit about the work you've done on cases like Malka Leifer's. Like, what does that look like? Like, how does the case come to you? How does it present itself? And then what do you end up doing with it?
So I'll start. There was a case that I can share a little bit about because it was somewhat public. We were contacted by a young woman who had been sexually abused severely when she was 5 years old by a man who made Aliyah from the U.S. many years ago. He had come here. He was a student in yeshiva, and he was living in like a apartment with a number of different students, young adults, and he was her neighbor, and he started kind of volunteering to help out with the kids. Her mother was pregnant at the time on bed rest, so he offered to babysit. This was the early 90s. People were not even it as informed as people in the Haredi community are now. They were less so then, by far. And he sexually abused 2 of the sisters, the 5-year-old and the 2-year-old. And he was arrested. He actually wasn't even arrested for abusing those kids. He was arrested for abusing another girl from a different family. He served 5 years in jail. However,
5 years.
5 years. Yeah.
And there was hard evidence that he was abused.
Yeah.
I mean, he was convicted.
Right. So this was, yeah. Now, that's not even the craziest part. Craziest part was, well, there's so many levels of crazy in this story. He was wanted in the U.S. And the police at some point realized that he was wanted in the U.S. because one of the parents remember someone making a comment about something, and we found out only afterwards that the police realized when they searched that he was wanted by Interpol for raping 2 9-year-olds in America. And the police at no point let the authorities in America know that he was wanted here, that he was here, like they had found him. He was here, he was in an Israeli jail.
Our police didn't?
Our police did not let Interpol know.
I mean, they could have extradited him.
Well, in order to extradite, they could have deported him. In order to extradite him, there would have had to have been a request. But they couldn't make the request if they didn't know
I'm saying they
he
could
was
have gotten
here.
him.
Yes, he could have been like, this. The 5 years was nothing compared to what he could have gotten. So, so we found out about this because the young woman, years later, the woman contacts us. She's in her early 20s. At the time that it happened, her parents had told her that he went away to jail for the rest of his life. They lied in order to protect her. She was terrified, dealing with horrific PTSD as a 5-year-old. She was in really difficult shape. And they told her what they needed to tell her for her to feel safe. I completely understand that. And now she's a young adult. She's in therapy. At some point in therapy, her parents tell her, by the way, he's out. I don't even remember how that came up. She was hysterical. She contacted us asking us to find him. So we, working with a number of different people in the community, some rabbis and whatever, we found him. He was living in a community up north. We contacted the police. Unfortunately, this was a number of years ago when the case started, and I made the mistake of trusting a journalist with the information as well, just that this was ongoing. I felt like it was very important for the media to cover the story just to raise awareness of the massive holes in the system. I don't even know if you can call it a hole when it's like that big. It's just like just a broken system. But the deal had been that the media wasn't going to actually publicize his name, until after he was arrested, because we knew he would just run again. And unfortunately, they reneged on that deal. After that, we now have another member of our staff. Our staff has grown significantly, I do have to say, since the early years. We have 15 or 16 staff members now. And one of them is a yoetz tikshoret, and he's a
communications advisor.
Yes, he's a communications advisor, and he's an advocate. He supports victims through the media process. So when we have a story that we want to share with the media, he's the one who represents the victim, so to speak, vis-a-vis the media. We don't just hand the media a story and have the victim go and interview, and then God knows what happens after that, because unfortunately a lot can happen.
This guy bolted.
Yep. So media shared the story. This guy ran again. So at that point, so the victim here in Israel was still in the process of deciding if she wanted to go to the police to make a report, because again, he had never been charged with the crimes against her.
Why didn't she do it as he was sitting, serving time?
Well, at the time, she was very young at the time. They tried interviewing her. She was unable to talk.
Okay.
And even though there was some physical evidence, just of her during the exam, that they discovered, but there wasn't enough without her testimony. So now it's years later, and she's deciding. So she, after a number of months, she decided. I mean, first of all, she had to process the fact that he was even out, that this was an option. She went to the police. The police go to arrest him. He had bolted 2 weeks earlier. He then moved again. After there was a series of
cat and mouse.
Yes.
He bolted within Israel?
Yes, within Israel.
Okay. It's like how it can't be that easy to disappear.
I will say one thing about the police, and we got
they suck.
Yeah, pretty much. Okay. And I don't say that lightly, because there are some detectives. We work with a lot of detectives who are unbelievable. Like, they are really devoted to their jobs, and they go way above and beyond, and they work insane hours without getting paid overtime. And then there are some that are garbage. And this case, unfortunately, was taken by police who the lieutenant in charge of the investigations in that particular station was fired. I believe this case had something to do with it. It was like a real embarrassment. They screwed up so badly. They said they couldn't find him. And we kept saying, well, what do you mean you can't find him? Like, I mean, if I don't pay 200 shekel for my cellcom bill, it doesn't matter what hole I hide out in. Like, I could find a cave in the they will find me somehow. I don't understand how you, like...
Cellcom, not the
seriously,
police. Cellcom will find you.
They will find me in that hole, and they will pull me out, and then I will pay, 2,000 shekel worth of fines for not paying them, somehow.
You should have opened a Cellcom
membership under his name. That's what we got to start doing, just putting bills under their name and cell phone companies. So they said they couldn't find him, except... skipping ahead to the end. Now, we, at that point, I said, okay, we're going to find him. We're going to find him. Like, come hell or high water, we got to find this guy. And we started searching. One of my investigators at the time, really, I mean, the number of hours that he spent driving up and down the coast. We thought we found him at one point in some area, and our investigator literally went, house to house, knocking on the door, asking if he could hang up mezuzot, for them, just pretending to be from Chabad, and that we've done a lot of things like that, just to try to figure out where. Couldn't find him anywhere, and then through a series of complicated maneuvers that I can't really share, we found out that he was going to be at a certain medical clinic on a certain day, and at that point we were working with CBS on a documentary of sorts, expose on a couple of cases, specifically on this topic. And they actually flew in a whole team from the UK to follow us to this appointment. I'm like, guys, there's a chance he doesn't show up. This is really, we've had situations like this before, and then he hasn't shown up. Thankfully he did, and it was so crazy. The whole situation, he showed up. We called the police. We said, we're, sitting outside this clinic. This guy is here. He is, this is his Teudat Zehut number. You have a tzav ma'atzar, there's a warrant for his arrest. Come and get him. They were, first of all, unbelievably confused. This was just a local police. We were, somewhere in the Merkaz. It wasn't but they sent, I will say, the police showed up very quickly. They arrested him. The whole thing was filmed. And then I called the victim, who was living in America at that point, to tell her that they found him and he had been arrested. That was a very emotional conversation. What was so crazy is that after it came out, we found out that, number one, we were contacted by, basically he he was in a rehab. He had suffered some medical issues, and the reason that we hadn't been able to find him was because he had been living in this rehab. And we got a phone call from a nurse at the rehab who said that from the time that he got there, months before, she felt like something was very off about the guy. She said she's never done this before. She's been working as a nurse for like 30 years. She's never done this. She Googled his name. And she found the Interpol website saying he's wanted. So she called the police. And she said, like, I have this guy here. He's wanted by the police. Now, she didn't even know that he was wanted by the Israeli police. She just knew he was wanted so she called the police.
The police didn't even know he was wanted by them, probably.
Yes. The police just kept saying, okay, yeah, we'll send someone. They never did. And then we found out that his official address, had gotten multiple letters from the police, from the actual station where he was, the station she had reported to, where we were, like, working.
You're wanted.
The ones that were, yes, please come in for an interrogation.
What a bunch of idiots.
Now, that's an acceptable, maybe that's an acceptable way to, like, invite someone in for an interrogation if they, like, are suspected of I don't know, stealing a bike.
Suspect.
For stealing a bike. Not like you've been a fugitive for 19 years for child rape. We're going to send you a letter. Like, please come in. And if you don't, also, he's a fugitive, meaning he might run. Again, how do we know this? Because he's done it before. Like, why would you send a letter? And then they kept claiming they didn't know where he was. No, it turns out they did know where he was. They just kept sending letters instead of going to arrest him. So, yeah, we found him. He was arrested. And that was like, I mean, that case was incredibly frustrating, especially because it wasn't even like, they didn't really need us. It wasn't, I mean, they shouldn't ever need us, but it wasn't even like a matter of like community connection. Sometimes there's like things that we can get away with asking that the police can't.
You had to do their job,
yes,
essentially.
This was very much us doing the police's job. I don't know what they were doing. It was a really crazy situation. But then we had another case, which I think was a more like classic, like this is where I feel like this is where we come in and where we can really be helpful. There was
can we follow up with that
Sure.
case for a few questions, and then
Yes.
I want to move on to the other one. But that's just insanity. So what happened with him in the end? He was arrested. Was he sent to?
No, so he was actually charged here in Israel with the crimes against the Israeli victim.
And then
He was convicted.
Yeah.
He was sentenced to 13 years.
13 years.
13 years.
For raping a 6-year-old, 5-year-old.
Yeah.
13
So we
years
gotta talk about
for
that.
raping that was my follow-up.
Yeah.
Is
That's-
like what are the minimums and maximums for these kinds of crimes in Israel,
I
or
mean,
are there?
There are officially, I think it's 7 years for each. I'm not the right person to ask about that. I'm not a lawyer or a prosecutor. I haven't worked in that so I'm not sure exactly what it is now. I think it's 7 years per charge. Now, ideally,
Meaning if
it
you
should be,
rape a 5-year-old,
No, I'm sorry. It's 7 years for molestation.
Rape is
Okay.
higher.
But what they usually do is they combine the charges. They almost never /never. I don't think I've ever heard of a case, which that's just me. I've never heard of a case where they sentence the person concurrently, meaning where they serve one sentence after another. So it's,
do you have
that's
any
being
idea
all
what the
once.
minimum is for raping?
The minimum for, I'm not sure.
But at least it's not any higher than 13. Meaning,
Well, certainly, right.
so meaning you
certainly
can
not.
rape a 5-year-old and not get more than and
Yes.
get 13 years in prison. That's
You
just insanity.
And 13,
Could get less in my
13
experience.
is, if with good behavior,
It's a third gets taken off.
third is taken off.
Yeah.
In Israel, almost always.
Yeah, the sentencing guidelines is one of the things that needs like a major reform here.
And do you have any idea what's holding that back, or why that is, or do you have any theories, ideas?
Well, I think the biggest one is actually
Knesset
prison-
members like
No, but wait.
Well,
wait,
this
I
has
wanna-
stayed the
I
same
wanna hear.
through many Knesset. So I will say I probably agree with whatever you were going to say, probably, but it has been the same through multiple governments. So I can't even point to like it being a specific government or any series of governments. I think it mostly has to do with money, in specifically prison over room in prisons. There is no room. There's no room in prisons in Israel.
It can't be that simple. What? There's no room to put pedophiles, so we're like, well, we just got to let them off after 13
We
years.
literally had a case last year, a year and a half ago, a guy had been, he was up for parole, and he had actually served a very short sentence. Unfortunately, it was a plea deal, and it was a complicated situation where he served it was something ridiculous, like 2.5 years. And after, he was up for parole potentially. They had a risk assessment. They had him undergo a risk assessment. The risk assessment found him to be too dangerous to be released. 1 week later, he was released. A week and a half later, he was released because of, I'll say it in English. It was like an administrative release because they ran out of room. Yeah.
But that's releasing. I'm wondering, like, when you sentence, are there sentencings where they say we can't sentence him to more because there's just no room?
No. So that's not how it works. It's not the judge's job to worry about the rooms in the prisons.
Yeah, they just sentence based on...
I'm talking about why the sentencing guidelines aren't longer. Like, why they don't... That has to do with the government.
Like, prisons would collapse, practically, with our statistics.
That's just
right?
insanity.
But, it's also a question... In Israel, it's not the only it's not the only offense that gets you out easy, right?
Yeah.
Also murder, or so, and it's always also a question because the law does allow the judge to charge to give more years,
you to more,
but the judges usually are very, very, very
lenient.
Lenient, and yeah. That's the big problem we have with the judges.
It's just infuriating, to think that someone like that got 13 years. Do you know what it is in the States? Like, do you have similar?
Well, rape, I don't know if it varies per state. I know that definitely in some states it's 25 to life.
Yeah. For not even for a minor. Like, not
right.
It doesn't matter if you rape a minor or.
Rape is very similar. I think I'm not sure how it varies between states, but in most places it's pretty close to murder.
It shouldn't. It's just, like, it shouldn't matter if you rape like a 19 or a 25-year-old or even though raping a 5-year-old is like, I don't know how you could say one is more despicable than the other.
It's hard just like when you get to levels of
despicable humans that they should go away for life and we should never see them again.
We don't want them in our streets.
The other thing is that if we're talking about funding that's needed for prison systems and reform, the perpetrators are not necessarily, and in fact are usually not given therapy in prison. Now, some people say, well, why do we need to give them therapy? We don't give them therapy. They should never see, sunlight again. Well, they're going to see sunlight again. That's number one. They're going to see sunlight again. So I'd rather they have some level of rehabilitation. Now, how successful is rehabilitation with adult offenders? Not very. But no one's going to argue that some therapy is better than no therapy. Like something. Maybe it'll save one victim. I mean, something. Yeah. That's what we would hope, but
I prefer that money to go build more cells. Okay, so let's talk about this other case that you were going to tell us.
And then we got to touch the Malka Leifer affair.
Yeah.
So yes, this other case was a case in the. I'm trying to think if there's. I think there's. It was public. It was a fairly public case, although our involvement wasn't really so public. There was a man from the East Coast who was one of his female relatives came forward that he had raped her, as well as, it turns out, a number of her sisters as well. There were a number of members of the extended family that he had abused severely for years. He was a Rosh Hashiva of a Shiva on the East Coast. Unfortunately, the police station where the case was being handled there were a lot of, the walls had ears, and he was tipped off the night before they went to go arrest him. He got on a plane to from JFK to Tel Aviv, and skipped the country. So they showed up to arrest him. He was gone. Now, I had heard about this case for years. It was like one of the, I mean, if you worked in my field, it was like one of the cases that we all knew. This guy was somewhere in Israel, and every so often we'd like hear rumors. Somebody would call us. I heard he's working with kids. I heard he's working in special ed. I heard he's working with, and nobody had any clue where he was. Now, I had never been in touch with the victim, so I don't tend to stick my nose into cases where I don't have any connection and a few years ago, one of the victims contacted us and asked, it was at some point during or like when the Malka Leifer case was sort of at its height, so they had heard about that and reached out to see if we could help. I'll be honest, like I wasn't sure that we could because, I mean, I'm not like, what we did with the Leifer case, which we'll get to in a minute, was honestly a shock to myself. I didn't know that we'd pull that off. But I said, okay, we're going to try. Like, obviously, if this is why we exist, we got to try. And that was a really tricky one because he was under the radar in a big way. He knew he was being looked for on some level. He was very Haredi. He was completely under the radar. Like, he was living here illegally. He had come as a tourist, and he never made Aliyah, so he was just living here, like, with false papers, and he didn't have... So there was really no Selcom to find him. There was no Kupat Cholim. There was nothing. So first I started sending letters to the prosecutor's office, to the police, to find out which unit had this case, who was looking for this guy. At this point, he had been there. This was 10 years after he'd come to Israel. So for 10 years, he's been hiding out in Israel. Nobody knows where he is. Trying to find the police. To my great luck, a detective was assigned the case. She wasn't really assigned it. She requested it by accident. She came across this case because her office had construction. It was a whole crazy situation. She comes across this case. She didn't even have the details. She just said, like in the cases when they send the extradition request, because I skipped that part. The U.S. did request extradition from Israel about 7 years prior. It took about 2 years from the time that he fled to the time they actually requested extradition. So she finds this case. She said, I saw just the summary, the description of what he was wanted for, and oh my God, like who's... So I asked the other detectives, like, who's looking for this maniac? And they said, nobody. You want it? Go at it. He's, somebody spent probably a couple of weeks looking for him, realized he's under the radar. We have no traditional ways to find this guy. Like, he doesn't have Facebook, doesn't have a cell phone, or if he does, it's not under his own name. Not going to find him. They stopped looking. Which also was really, what was upsetting to me is that, like, afterwards, when he was arrested, the police said, after years of searching. No, it wasn't after years of searching. It was after a few months of a very unbelievably dedicated detective searching. And then she did something which I give her amazing kudos for. She went high up in the police and got permission to work with us, and which was obviously like highly sensitive and highly confidential. And we shared with her what we knew. She shared a limited amount of what they knew, and then we started looking. We found, basically the way that we had found him was we found his best friend. He had a friend who moved to Israel at one point. We found him. We actually found where he had been living up until 3 months prior. He had just left. How did we find out? Because we sent a guy to all the local shuls, like the shtibels, the minion factories, and with his picture. And they found a bunch of people, like he had been davening mincha there till about 3 months before that. He had left.
I'm sure you don't go around saying, do you know this pedophile? You say,
No.
You say, like, no. I'm looking for my brother or something like that.
There's a story. It was a whole thing. He told everyone that he was his Rebbe in yeshiva years before, and he's been wanting to meet him and thank him and something. Then we found the best friend, and we called the best friend, and no one could get... The big issue was they couldn't get this best friend's cell phone number. Everyone knew his house number was listed. No one could get his cell phone number. They tried, couldn't get it. We called him, spoke to... I think one of our staff called his daughter. Whole thing about how it was about a shidduch. It's very urgent. If we don't reach him right now, the shidduch is going to fall through. And that's like the magic words. You're going to get anything. You get nuclear codes if a shidduch is going to fall through. So we got a cell phone number. Once we had a cell phone number, we gave that to the police. They were able to use that to figure out who he had been in contact. Yes. Something. I don't know what they did there. They did what they did.
Yeah, we all know what they did now.
I'm not going to say it. No one will ever work with me again.
Yeah.
They did what they did. They did it well, and within a week or so, he had been arrested. So, really, like, I have so much respect for, like, I feel like that's a detective who, like, all that mattered to her was getting the job
Yeah.
done. She didn't care who she had to work with. Like, that wasn't even, and
But
that's where I feel
unfortunately,
like,
it's not one good apple, right? The saying is one rotten apple,
yes,
right? Like, so a couple good apples.
yeah. She was,
Isn't good enough.
she was great. Her unit was great, but that was really, it was hard because I just felt like this is, like, we could help you guys with this kind of thing. Like, they're not gonna call up a guy and, like, pretend to have a shidduch, like, or maybe they will, but they won't. I don't think they'll be able to sell it the way
Yeah.
that we did.
Yeah,
And they
yeah.
extradited him?
Yeah.
Because the whole thing
Yeah.
with Malka Leifer, and we need to talk about it a little bit, is that extraditing, like, why do all those people run away here? Because it's not, like, Israel is a bit reluctant to extradite, no?
And also
Right.
the cops apparently are looking for you.
Yeah.
The cops are lazy.
The cops send you mail.
Right. You are wanted for rape.
Please come to the nearest
Yes.
at your free time. At your
Yes,
free
when you have a
will.
chance.
Drop by.
We're
Yeah.
right around the corner.
Yep. So Malka Leifer was different because she was an Israeli citizen. Israel is very reluctant to extradite its citizens. Less reluctant with non-citizens.
Okay.
This guy actually he would have, if he hadn't been extradited, he would have been deported because he was here illegally for 11 years. So they did have a good basis to deport him also.
Okay, so if he would have tried to get, there's a reason these guys don't get citizenship, because if he would have tried to go through official channels, he would have
Yeah.
been found.
I'll be honest
So
with
they
you.
tried
To
to
be
stay-
honest,
yeah.
at the time, now at this point it's 13 years ago when he first came here. If he would have tried to make Aliyah, he probably would have been able to.
No one would have asked.
I don't think anyone would have noticed.
He was probably
It was
just
like
too
a
scared.
solid chance. Yeah, he was afraid.
To, like,
he
raise
was
his
wanted.
head
Right.
above,
So he was keeping underground.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So back to the Leifer affair.
So I heard about Malka Leifer, I don't remember what year, it was 2016? It was somewhat early on when the case was, like, I heard about it because everyone that worked in my field, which was like 6 people at that point in the world, knew about it and were obviously extremely disturbed by it. At that point, she was still during the, like, sort of initial extradition proceedings. So
You
she
need to
had
tell
been-
the story for people who
yes,
don't.
okay.
Yeah.
So Malka Leifer was a principal of a girls' high school, the Haredi Hasidic Girls' High School in Melbourne, Australia. There she abused a number of students. And when the school became aware, when the board of the school became aware of the accusations, they put her on a plane back to Israel. That's the short summary. It took a year and a half, I think, for the authorities to request extradition. It's important for people to also remember extradition is like it's kind of complicated and really expensive, like, as a process, like, to the government. So it doesn't happen like people say, oh, we'll just extradite them. Well, it's not so simple
The
to do.
girls are Australian. They
Yes.
filed a complaint in
Australia. Yeah, which took a while because these are girls coming from a really, really insular community, like as insular as it gets. And so they had made the report. It took a while for the authorities to, like, move things forward. The extradition was requested, and at that point she was arrested. Now, what usually happens in cases of sexual abuse, and this includes extradition cases, which is insane, which I'll get to in a second, is that the standard is that they're released to house arrest. Unless there's some sort of extenuating circumstance. With sex crimes, they're released to house arrest. Extenuating circumstances would be, I'm trying to think, I've only had a few cases ever where the person has been kept in prison throughout the duration of the trial. And that is, in one situation, they had him on tape threatening to murder the victim. He get kept
That'll
in jail.
do it.
Yep. And then another one where also they had reason to believe that he was, like, a serious physical danger to multiple victims, and they also knew there were multiple other victims that hadn't come forward yet. They knew he would, if he was out, he would, like, discourage them from coming forward, to put that very lightly. So he was also kept in jail, and I can't even remember any others at the moment. So you would think that extradition, or when someone's a fugitive, meaning they're being held on charges relating to them fleeing another country, that would be considered an extenuating circumstance. Like, why would we want to keep someone in jail so they don't run? What would give us an indication that they're going to run? Well, they already did it once. Like, why wouldn't she go to Morocco? But they didn't keep her in. She was released to house arrest. And then at that point, that was when the fun started, where there would be a hearing, and she didn't show up. 2 days before the hearing, she'd check herself into a hospital. she would be in the hospital. Her lawyer would show up at the hearing and say, oh, she's so unwell, she can't come to court. She's in the hospital. The court would adjourn for another 2 months. A day later, she'd be out. And this just kept repeating itself. And we're all thinking, well, this is idiotic. Like, clearly, she's like, what are the odds that 2 days before she gets unbelievably ill? Like, and then all of a sudden she's fine again, right after the day after the hearing. And then at some point, so this repeated itself over and over and over again. And I remember at one point, the first time I went to like a protest, which again, there were like 5 of us there, at the court when we first started hearing about this case. And I remember I got there to the court and I said to the guards, like at the front, they said, what hearing are you here for? And I told them, and I remember she said, you know, she's not meant to, you know, like she's not supposed to be coming. And I was like, oh, she's supposed to be coming. She's not going to come, which is the problem, but she's supposed to be. Like, they were already, as far as everyone was concerned, this was already a done deal. She wasn't coming. She was, this was just a joke. Like, we were just all pretending that this was a court case, and really, it was a charade completely. And then I didn't really get involved for a while after that. At that point, the judge ruled that she should undergo a psychiatric evaluation. She was evaluated by the Jerusalem district psychiatrist, who ruled that she was unfit to be extradited. Now, it's important to be clear about this, because sometimes people think that she was ruled that she was mentally ill. That's not accurate. People can be mentally ill and stand trial. There are some that would argue that the vast majority of people on trial for violent crimes, sex crimes, are mentally ill in some way. They have some sort of, I don't know, personality disorder or something. They're, you know, like, most people are not 100%, but that doesn't, there's a difference between being unwell and being unfit to stand trial. Like, the level of awareness that a person has to have and the level of understanding of the process that they're going through.
She doesn't talk to chairs.
Right, exactly. So, like, the fact that, like, she has anger problems does not mean, like, okay, so we won't put anyone on trial if they've got, you know, like, issues with, I don't know, anything. So that was actually what really ended up, I think they lied so much that actually was their undoing. Like, had they just said she was like a little bit unfit, they might have gotten away with it, because they could have continued to argue that she could be a little bit unfit and still live a somewhat normal life. But instead, they really argued, like, they were on record, her team, saying that she was so, like, she would be brought into the psychiatrist's office, like they would have to carry her in by both arms, like a sack of potatoes, like she was practically nonverbal. And then all of a sudden, well, I'm skipping ahead, I'll get to that in a minute. So the psychiatrist said that she was unfit. The judge ruled that the case was now going to be, like, paused, frozen, and every 6 months she would undergo another assessment from the psychiatrist for up to 10 years. And then at the 10 years, it would just be considered.
Who's this judge? They should be on trial.
The judge was working with the information that she was given. I mean, it was traced that was ultimately what ended up getting Litzman.
That's like you meet someone like working with the information. If any of these stories would happen outside of a courtroom, you'd be like, this person's like,
right, like, get out of town. You're curly,
like what? You're gonna let people well,
that's the thing
fool
about
you
court.
like that?
That is the thing about court that it's really important for people to understand. There's
Israeli court.
To some degree, yes, it's worse here, but to some degree, all courts, they're only allowed to rule on what's in front of them. It doesn't matter, and it's part of the most maddening piece of being, and I always tell victims this, like, you have to come in with this sort of, like, understanding that what you're watching is like a play. Everyone's playing a part. The defense attorney lying, and he knows he's lying, and they know he's lying, and we know he's lying. Everyone knows he's lying, and yet this is his job. And the judges have to ask this and say this, even though, like, it's all a bunch of, like, we all know that this is... I was in court this morning with a case that, like, everybody knows. Everyone sitting in that room knows that there are tens of other victims. This guy is a predator for decades. But only one victim, that's not true, a couple victims came forward, only one was still in the statute. They are only allowed to rule on the one victim that's in front of them. So the defense attorney gave this closing argument on and on about how he's always had a clean record, and he's always, even though we all know that this is flat out BS, the judges know it too. He's allowed to say it because...
But that makes sense to me. Meaning, because, you know, there's evidence and you have to, like, if something is in front of the court, but the idea that like they can just bring a doctor's note in, that's got to be easily, I don't know, countered by a judge with 2 brain cells.
Well, I mean, the judge
you
is
can't
not
just keep
allowed-
bringing me in
Right.
random doctor notes. Like bring
Well,
in
it
the
wasn't
doctor.
a random
I don't know. Like, you
doctor's
can-
note. It was actually the district psychiatrist. Like that's what was so, and that's what
It
made.
said he needs 10 years.
No, it said that it said right now she's unfit.
So then the
that they
district
said every
psychiatrist is accountable for
He
such a
is.
ridiculous.
That's what happened.
So then who is this guy?
Well, the district psychiatrist was getting orders from Litzman. That's why Litzman ended up.
That's
That was Litzman's
okay.
involvement. Yeah, he was.
It wasn't proven though.
Okay.
Yeah, it
right.
was. I mean, he pled guilty.
He pled guilty to have gotten.
Afrat Emunim or something. I don't remember how it was a plea deal. It was
okay.
he's not allowed to serve in the, whatever.
Litzman admitted
Litzman,
guilty.
yeah.
Okay.
So
Litzman was the minister of
Health.
health.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
So he was this guy's
Ironically.
boss.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's go back to. So she's got 6 months assessment.
So she gets 6 months assessment.
Yeah, every
One
6 months for
assessment,
10 years.
Right, up to 10 years.
Up to
So
10 years.
so one assessment, she's still unfit. 2 assessments, she's still unfit. I think it went through 3 assessments, still unfit. Somewhere around then, it was in 2018. 2018, end of 20, beginning of, I don't remember. I met with the 3 survivors for the first time. They came to Israel. They asked if they could meet with me, and I was more than happy to meet with them. I mean, they were unbelievable. I felt like there was very little for me to offer at that point. This case was like up in the highest levels of government. Like this was, I remember that same week that they came, Bibi had a meeting with the Prime Minister of Australia, and they discussed the Leifer case. And I was like, I don't know what I can do in this thing. If the it's we kind of brought this has gone to the top. I don't know what else and when I met with them, I just felt like I asked them, okay, what have you been doing while you're here? Tell me about your trip. They were in the Knesset. They were literally like, there were some really awesome political people who like brought them, like snuck them into like all the MKs. They were like knocking on doors, literally like meeting, like there was
Lobbying.
nothing that they had, yes, for their cause, which is ridiculous that they should have to do that. But they just like, they felt like someone was putting their foot on someone had their foot on the scale, which turns out someone did. They felt like they needed all the pushing that they could get, or all the awareness that they could get. And they were really, like I said, they went to every level. And I had so much like respect for these women, because I have met some really unbelievable people in my job. I mean, I actually really liked what you said earlier. I don't remember how you phrased it, but part of the awareness raising that I love that we do, that was important to me to do, is that I feel like a lot of the sexual abuse stories about the Haredi community that get told are from a very kind of voyeuristic perspective, understandably so, but there's like almost like we're looking in on like people like there's new animals, like how do they do that? And really there's like unbelievable courage and creativity, like survivors that are told they can't do this, so they like find a way around the system, just like real courage and perseverance, and like we want to tell those stories from those perspectives in a way obviously that honors the privacy and whatever of course of the survivors. Anyway, so I met the 3 of them, and they were like, they are beyond, like I couldn't even, you would think that these women are like trained lawyers and activists and lobbyists, like the way, like they really like they were going to, yes. Yeah. They were going to really like fight this thing till the end. All they were asking for was the chance to face her in court. That's all they wanted. And they were just so inspiring. And I remember I said to them like very casually, like, okay, what can I do? Because I just feel like there's nothing that I can do here. Like what, I didn't even say that. No, that's not true. I'm sorry. I didn't say what can I do. I said, what would make a difference in this case? Like, is there something that you think would actually do something? And one of them told me that at this point, their lawyer really feels like unless someone brings evidence that she's faking this unfitness, this level of mental illness, that there's never going to be, like, she might really get away with this. And I said, okay, well, let's look at that. What would that entail? Now, the year before, there had been this whole big, like, blitz on Facebook where there had been a picture posted by a girl. It turns out it was a seminary girl, like an 18-year-old Hasidic girl who had been in Meron for Lag BaOmer and saw Leifer in Meron, just living her best life. And took a picture of her. It was a very blurry picture. This picture was posted on Facebook. There was, fury and whatever, and everyone following the story was obviously furious. This woman's, being assessed as being so unfit she can't get on a plane. She's really just strolling around in Melbourne. So I asked what happened with that, and they said, well, that's not official evidence. The fact that it went on Facebook and a lot of people got angry, that's all good and fine, but the girl that took the picture was not willing to go to the police. She's an 18-year-old Hasidic girl. She's not taking this picture to the police and testifying that this is an authentic picture and she saw Malka Leifer. That's not happening. So they need, serious evidence. And I was like, well, could we get the serious evidence? Well, what if we got that? They were like, if you could, that would be amazing. And I was like, I'm gonna work on that. I'll get back to you. And I remember, I remember where I was standing. It was right near, Machne Yehuda in Jerusalem. And I called my... the CEO of JCW, which was the organization in America that we were working with at the time, and I described this situation, and I was like, this is what could make a difference in this case. I want to hire a PI. And he was like, go for it, figure this out, figure out what makes sense. And I immediately called one PI that we had worked with a little bit in the past. I knew that he had worked a lot in the Hasidic community. I wanted to make sure we have one shot at this. It's got to be someone who's going to really blend in. I also didn't want to do it ourselves, even though I can follow this lady just as well as, but I knew her lawyers personally, and I knew that I wanted somebody licensed. I didn't want any room for any you weren't allowed to be doing this was going to be completely above board as a PI can be. This was in early November, I think. We decided to do it over Hanukkah in December because I wanted a time where I felt like there would be the most chance that she'd be out and about. So I figured at the very least, lighting the menorah, she'd be coming out of her house to the front. We'd see her. And for that full week, they followed her. And I was terrified because, first of all, it was not a cheap endeavor, and I really knew we had one shot at this. A, because we're a nonprofit organization, we just didn't have the funds to continue following her indefinitely, and B, I didn't know how this could blow up in our face. I didn't know what would happen afterwards, and we just they started following her. And I remember the first morning, I didn't even tell anyone on our staff. Only my partner in America knew. No one knew that we were doing this. And the first day, I still have it, the picture that they sent me, the PI sent me of her and her porch. And he just was like, okay, we're started. And there was a picture of her on her phone, on her porch. And until I saw that picture, I really didn't think it was going to work. I just didn't. And they followed her the whole week. And it wasn't until the weekend, the first few days, she was in and out a little bit, not a picture of her on
amount.
Her
phone is not
Yes
enough.
And no, because she spent
but
hours on her phone on the porch. She liked to pace on her porch on the phone for hours on end, which, again, doesn't really paint the same picture as the woman who has to be carried in by two arms.
But they could say, she's been talking to her phone, and there's nobody on the other end.
Or she's talking to a psychiatrist. I don't. Right,
whatever.
For sure. It wouldn't be enough on its own. Yeah. Then Thursday came around, and she started her Shabbos shopping. She got on a bus to Bnei Brak. They followed her to Bnei Brak on the bus. She went to the post office. She went to the dry cleaner. She went to, the woman just did
movies.
All of her, all the shopping. She met up with her daughter.
Started dancing in the street.
She was completely she was fine. She was just living at one point her lawyer tried with are you claiming that mentally ill people can't take buses? No, sir. But you didn't argue she's mentally ill. You argued she's unfit. That's not the same thing. You argued she's so unfit she can't get on a plane. Yet clearly she's fit enough to get on a bus by herself. She is fit. So then, of course, began the battle of the psychiatrists, because the judge is not even allowed to take a look at this and say, okay, this means she's not fit, even though, again, common sense would dictate, well, clearly this is...
You have to have the psychiatrist say...
The psychiatrist needs to look at this and say, okay, yeah, this is...
And this is still a dirty psychiatrist.
Right. So the psychiatrist, so that's where things started
didn't know
getting...
at the time.
Right. Things started getting hinky. We started getting some phone calls. I got some cryptic phone calls from people who worked within the Ministry of Health in various capacities. There were rumors. The psychiatrist division, it was becoming sort of a known secret that, because right away within the field, the I almost until we found out that he was whatever, I kind of felt bad for the psychiatrist. Do you imagine being the guy who gave his professional assessment, keeps the woman in Israel, and then all of a sudden it turns out she's faking it. Like, he fell for this fraud. Like, I was like, oh God, this is like, talk about being like making, your worst day at work, like being portrayed on the international stage, like, oh, Australia's following it. So yeah, it turns out like people within the like that division, the psychiatrist office knew that something was off. Like, it had been,
and something was off. In the end, what ended up being uncovered was that Leitzman was telling him to do.
He was leaning on the psychiatrist.
But no one really. I mean, the best they could do is hafarat emunim, so that means that he was like pressuring him.
Well, no, I think they did more than that. I think he pled guilty to like the lesser of the charges, which is how plea deals work. Just to
but I'm saying, but they charged him with what? Paying him off?
No, it wasn't paying. He didn't give any money, as far as I know. It was more of a, he was his boss.
So he threatened to fire him?
It's an implied threat.
I see.
Of, we need this to go one way and work for me.
But where do you go with this, Eitan? Like, what's
just saying that the district nothing happened to the district attorney.
The district attorney.
The district psychiatrist. Sorry.
I'm actually not sure if they... I have my suspicions that they must have needed his involvement in order to get...
Right,
they
maybe
usually try to go for the
minister. In order to get
fish.
the minister, you had to cut a deal with the psychiatrist.
That's usually how these things work. I don't know if that's what happened here. I didn't
Google
follow
it
that.
later.
I mean, they could have charged him with something, but
perhaps
yeah,
because that's pretty feckless thing. That's pretty spineless to like. It's kind of.
I can tell you that there were people within that office that contacted us. My God, I showed up to one meeting once with like 3 hidden cameras and like a knife. I like really was afraid someone was gonna kidnap me. I had people waiting in cars and all. I was contacted by someone from that office because at one point when the case was, after the private investigation part was done and when it was being reassessed by other psychiatrists, and the truth is I took this as a compliment to just like, they were, the person that was contacting us he needed to make sure that it was known that they shouldn't let, basically Litzman was still leaning on more people. And they didn't feel comfortable disclosing this to anyone because they would be fired or were afraid they'd be fired. And he basically said, like, you're the only people that I trust that you'll pass this information along where like you won't come back to me.
Yeah.
Which again, I just felt like was a compliment in that like we are trusted that we have only
integrity.
one agenda here. Yes, and like that's.
But what's the hidden forces behind this? Like, how the forces seem so powerful?
Why would Litzman care? I mean,
Litzman. I don't know. It seems how deep does this thing go? Like, why was she so powerful? She had the money to hire communication advisors, the best in the country, lawyers, fleeing, all this. What's behind the curtain here?
I don't think it's not about her. She's actually not so powerful. Even her husband's family, her father-in-law is on trial right now for sexual abuse. Also, her husband's family's. It's bad news. But it wasn't about her. It was about what stood to come out, I think, once she gets convicted. First of all, in Australia, they were threatening and possibly still are threatening, that's not the right word, but there was the threat that, quote unquote, that they were going to open an investigation into the board for actually criminal, like that they claimed that the reason that they sent her away is because according to their contract with her, they had paid for her flight. That was part of the deal when she came to Australia, and that once the position had ended, they were duty bound to send her back on a plane. Of course, in the dead of night, absolutely. This was just about, making good on their contract. So that's their claim, that they were just honoring their contract with her. They had to send her back to Israel once they fired her, which they did because she had sexually abused someone. So that was the way that they spun it. But I think that there was a concern that once she came back and once that trial happened, that there would be a criminal investigation into the board. So there was a lot of motivation on that end to fund her defense here so that she would never get back there. That was number one. Number two, she she came to Israel well into adulthood. People don't generally start sexually abusing that late in life. Like, that's not the typical. I think this was reported on a little bit in the media, although they never ended up getting to details because none of the alleged victims would come forward. There were allegations regarding the time before she had gone to Australia. And I believe that there was a lot of concern about that coming out and the liability that there would be if that part ever came out. The school that she taught in, there are some very powerful people there, and that's where I think the Litzman connection was.
And okay. So Litzman was connected to some community here in Israel that was impacted by her crimes.
Yeah.
Okay. So how did she end up getting extradited?
So after I had all this evidence, and I mean, I didn't actually have it. I asked them not to send it to me because, like I said, I didn't want the lawyers to be able to make any argument that I edited it, falsified it, did anything with it. So I told them, you keep it, the PIs. I went to the police. First I called the prosecutor's office because I didn't know what to do with this. I'd never done anything like this before. And the prosecutor was like, do not talk to me. There's la, 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 like he's not allowed to hear this from me. He's like, I'm going to tell the police to call you. I get a phone call from the police. The police asked me to come in. I come in. Honestly, I still, like, whatever. I don't know what the hell they thought of me. I know they were like I walk in, I'm like this religious woman, and I'm like, I have this information, and I don't know what they expected. And then I like launch into this story. And I just remember at one point, the guy who's sitting there interviewing me is like, hold on. And he goes out and he comes back with like his staff. Like there's like 4 other people that come into him, and they're like, what?
Police Academy cadets.
Right, like, what did you do? And I was like,
he's like, listen, guys, this is how you do your job.
So they actually got very excited because I think it was like, they don't get to usually do fun stuff like this. So, and the truth of the matter is,
listen to people tell them how to do their job.
The follow-up of what happened next. They took the what we brought them, which I didn't even give it to. I just said, okay, here, call this guy. I gave them the PI's number. They called him. The PI came in and gave it all to them directly. And at that point, the police started their own private investigation, following up. What they wanted to do is get evidence of her wellness up until the days around the court case, meaning they didn't want her to be able to say, oh, well, she was fine 3 weeks ago, but then she deteriorated later on, which was smart, actually. Like, I didn't really thought that deep into it, but it was I really think that was a good move. And they also, with the evidence that we brought to them, were able to tap her phones. So they had a whole bunch of recordings of her conversations as well, like the specifics of her conversations. And then they arrested her. I was actually in America when they arrested her. I had gone for a visit, and it was like the middle of the night my time. I wake up and I had missed like 45 calls, and I was like, what the heck is going on? And there was this whole, and no one understood what had happened, like how, and then I remember the media was going crazy because in court they had talked about, like, in the when the case, she was back in court, and they were talking about there was some organization that had done this investigation. No one knew which organization. Nobody, like, there was just so much drama around it. And I was just, like, minding my own business, just waiting for them to do. And then I found out, because I was really naive. I really, at the time, thought that we're going to bring this to them. There'll be, like, a couple hearings, and that's it. She's going to be on a plane. Then, like I said, became the battle of the psychiatrists. The psychiatrist, then they had to bring another psychiatrist. Multiple psychiatrists had to review the footage. They had to assess the footage, then they had to assess her, and then they had to assess, and then the defense attorney was allowed to bring psychiatrists. All in all, I think she was assessed by like 6 different psychiatrists.
What was the period of time?
2.5 years until she was finally extradited. It took
how many psychiatrists does it take to
extradite
tell a pedophile that's faking it?
You really
6.
A lot. It turns out
6.
They were really that was just, it was crazy. It was, the whole thing was so, and then every hearing, and we would sit there for hours and hours listening to them debate this of like, is she, isn't she, is she, isn't she? It was, I just couldn't like believe that it was so. I mean, I also think that at a certain point the judge wanted to make sure it wouldn't get turned over on appeal. So she was giving them a lot of liberty, like a lot of, they wanted 3 different psychiatrists from their side to assess her. She let them have all 3. Like it just took so long. And of course in Israel, there's not enough judges. Just, that's clear. So it takes months in between hearings. Like you don't usually have hearings one after another. It's usually like I mean, I think that's also the difference because in America, for example, because they have jury trials, they're forced to have the cases are like all at once. Like you have a trial that goes on for 2 weeks, or like if it's a really crazy case, then it'll be a month. But it's all one day after another consecutively. You don't have like a hearing and then another hearing. And like the case that I was at this morning, the next hearing's April 7th. Like that's how this works. And then once you get to the summer, and then they have then forget about it. It could be 5 months. So it took a really long time.
And eventually,
ultimately, she
extradited her.
was extradited. Is she an Israeli citizen though?
She's an Israeli citizen.
So
yeah.
they extradited. I didn't even know that was possible.
Yeah. They can.
rare though.
Yeah.
Pretty
Yeah,
rare.
definitely more so. Yeah.
And what happened to her in Australia?
She was convicted.
And what's the
Those
punishment?
Aussies.
Let's
Those Aussies.
Yeah.
I don't want to know.
They have jury,
Yeah.
right? They have jury.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
We're the only, by the way, guys, we're the only ex-British colony that doesn't have jury.
Really?
Yeah.
The
Wow,
only
that's
one? I
interesting.
didn't know that.
That's because the Brits were said, like, if we have jury, it will be formed by Jews and Arabs, and if it's a trial against a British soldier or something, we're screwed. So, right? Because
Wow.
the
I didn't know
locals,
that.
yeah.
Huh.
So they
They still wear the stupid robes though,
yeah, but not the
Yeah.
not the
Wigs.
wigs. Yeah.
Okay, so how long did she get? How much time did she get
Oh, I should know this.
in Australia?
1 second. She got.
Hey Google,
So yeah.
how long
Was
did-
Malka Leifer
Hold
sentenced
on.
to
I have
prison
to
for
remember
in
because there was
Australia?
also they also included time served.
15 years.
Who are you talking to?
Yes.
18.
15, I heard.
15? Okay.
15 years.
It was around that, but then I don't remember if that was before the time that they took off or after. You really would think I would remember that, but there's unfortunately
I
there's
have
so many of these.
two
that I
quick
don't-
questions before we wrap things up. First of all, the victims, did they pay a price in their communities, in their lives, in the Malka Leifer case?
Well, there's no question. You mean in terms of for reporting?
Yeah, for
Meaning aside from the pain and suffering they already went through, of course.
I think that for them, there was, there's the price on the communal level of like the level of ostracization for having reported someone from within such an insular Haredi community. And certainly, I don't want to speak to that too much because I feel like that's something that's very much their life. But there's no question that they did pay a price there. Aside from that, they paid obvious prices for just the practicalities of fighting this kind of fight for as long as they did. And there were certainly, like literally practically, they think about the number of times they had to fly to Israel, the number of times they had to, all those things do not cost nothing. There are actual costs associated with fighting this kind of extended, drawn out battle. And I think about that all the time, that even the victims here in Israel, the simplest of cases, so to speak, victims are the taking off of work to come to court and for the meetings, because there always has to be meetings with the prosecutor before the case and after the case, whatever. There's a lot of practical costs associated with this. And that's obviously the case for anyone from any community. It is not a simple thing. It's not a simple decision, which is why I can absolutely say that I have no judgment for any victim that decides they don't want to go that route, that doesn't want to report to the police. Obviously, I have tremendous appreciation for victims who do, because there's also the public safety component. But I absolutely understand when someone chooses not to. It is not easy.
And you said you work also in America and also here, right?
We used to. We used to work in America.
But you have this perspective.
Mm-hmm.
So would you say that like a jury would be more helpful for your cause, right, than the Israeli judicial system? If we had a jury, would it?
That is a good question. On the most basic level, it would be easier because, like I said, they'd be forced to actually adjudicate cases all at once. And that's a big pro, because cases take like a year and a half minimum to get through here with the number of
and justice-wise?
I think that there would be, it definitely could help. Because I think that juries, this isn't a matter of what I think. This is pretty clearly borne out from that juries tend to be more emotional than the judges will be. So they tend to ask for longer sentences and be more
Convict.
punitive. Yeah.
Wow.
You are an inspiration, first of all.
Thank you.
Really. Thank you so much for sharing all these stories and all this information. And it's insightful, but also inspiring, and it gives some hope, to know that there are people out there looking out for our kids, and for
things are changing. That's important for me to say. I can just, on the most basic level, when I first started doing this, I think it was 2 years from the time that I started in this job, 2 or 3 years, till the first time that I brought a victim to the police. It wasn't even like, I don't think at the beginning, I don't think I even thought about it. Like, it was just getting victims to agree to go to therapy was hard enough. And then now, at this point, we have days that we don't have enough members of staff and volunteers to bring all the victims to the police that are reporting, one in Haifa and one in Beitar and one in Jerusalem and one in whatever, like Modini, they're like, we'll have people all over the place just with victims in court.
And do you take, I'm assuming you don't turn anybody away, but do you only take on cases from the Haredi community, or?
No, it's a really good question. I would never turn anyone away. What's unique about us is that all of our staff are either in or from the Haredi community. Like, we all have a real deep understanding from various different sects and factions, but we're all everyone has a really strong
added
understanding.
Value there.
Yeah. So we can offer a lot of unique understanding. There are things that we'll do. Like, when we have victims that come to us from certain Hasidic communities, we will help them get to a rabbi to give them the okay to go to the police. Not because I need the okay. I know it's okay. My rabbi says it's always okay. There's, and they're not even because they need the okay, but because I know that the day after, they're going to start getting phone calls from their children's schools and from their jobs saying, how could you have done this? They're going to have to live with the pushback, not me. I get to go home at the end of the day. And I know that what would help them is having a letter from a rabbi saying that they were okay to do this. But then we have to find a rabbi who actually understands this issue and who we actually know is going to be supportive. So that's something that no other Merkaz Siyua, no other crisis center is going to do that I'm familiar with. Not because they don't support, they would support any victim who reaches out to them, but they're not going to have that understanding, and they're also not going to have all those rabbis on speed dial. And they don't have those relationships with the rabbis where they can just call up and say, yes, in this case, it's very necessary. It's the best thing for the victim. Yes, she's ready for it. Yes, so we wouldn't turn anyone away, but I might, if I feel like there's another center that would be better suited for that victim, I might refer them and make the introduction. I mean, certainly, I've been asked before, what would you do if a victim from the Arab community reached out? So there, I think especially, there's such a potential cultural difference that I would really want them to get help from a crisis center that has people that speak their language, that understand what they're dealing with. Do you know,
though, centers that fit some
absolutely.
of the big, and you trust them?
Yeah. I think for the most part. Not all of them do all the things that we do. I know that that sort of private investigation type stuff that we do is very unique to us. I don't know of anyone else that does that. Yeah,
you wouldn't really be able to blend into the Arab community very well.
Right.
Go undercover there.
We actually had one volunteer who showed up, and he had a lot of experience with that, and I was like, unfortunately, that's the one thing that I don't think I have any, I don't know what I'm going to do with you here. That's not so useful to me.
Can people donate?
Yes.
How?
Yes, of course. We always appreciate that. Through our website is really probably the easiest way. It's magen-israel.org.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Okay, Shana, thank you so much for coming. Really appreciate it.
Thank you for
really,
having
really
me.
appreciate it. Thank you. Guys, tune in next time.
Bye, guys.
Bye.